guys, welcome back to One Room Schoolhouse. We've been talking some about the first and second Great Awakening and maybe indications of why we believe we might be in the middle of a third Great Awakening. But before we get into much of the context of the third Great Awakening, or maybe some of what we're seeing culturally today, we want to spend a little time going back again to the first Great Awakening, second Great Awakening, and we're going to be in the first Great Awakening for a little bit longer because there's a lot more important context to learn. We talked about how there was a challenging of existing status quo, that denominations didn't always agree, that a lot of the movement that was happening on a local level, but there was enough local things happening that it felt like a national movement. The main guy who was the national figure would be George Whitfield. We talked about the fact that he went on 7 journeys from Georgia to roughly the area of Maine and back, and actually his story is kind of significant because in Georgia, he was chosen to be one of the chaplains of Georgia when Georgia becomes a state. So it's also kind of an interesting feel, recognizing that back then the colonies were pretty profoundly religious and Christian. They had different beliefs denominations-wise, but they definitely were Christian. He was there with the Wesley brothers. And one of the things that led George Whitfield to his first missionary journey is the idea that we learned from James in the Bible is that pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this, to look after widows and orphans when they are in need, when they have trouble. And so George Whitfield is helping in Georgia. They start an orphanage in Georgia, and George Whitfield realizes that we need to get funding for this orphanage in Georgia. So his first missionary journey, so to speak, is actually him just going and raising money in other colonies for Americans and Christians to support this orphanage in Georgia. But as he continues traveling, after maybe his first journey, second journey, he starts doing more preaching and teaching. And even though he's the guy that is nationally recognized, or at least recognized nationally as maybe the head of the first Great Awakening, it's interesting early on in his missionary journeys how much opposition he encountered as he's just going and teaching from the Bible. He went through a lot of things as a missionary.
He did. And by the way, in addition to the opposition, let me throw out one other thought that kind of goes with this as well. We tend to think that if we can have a revival, it's finally a time when we can kind of relax spiritually. It's maybe a time to coast because we've been fighting battles for a long time and cultural battles and political battles, and I just want to rest for a while. That never happened with Whitfield. He never had a time where he could rest. He was in that revival, and he literally worked himself to death, literally, over that revival. Over those 7 missionary journeys, he preached some 18,000 times in America, 34 years. He preached about 16,000 times in Great Britain. So he's got about 34,000 sermons he has over those 34 years, so nearly 1,000 a year, which is nearly 3 sermons a day on average. And he's riding horseback between those sermons. That's a lot of hard work. I mean, he had a portable pulpit with him. He'd keep it on his horse and throw it up and preach to this group and load it on the horse and go to the next group and stopping that is a lot of hard work, and it literally killed him what he did, but it was a revival. Now, he didn't know that at the time. We look back and say, that's a great awakening. So there's a lot of hard work that goes into it. It's not a time to coast and relax and enjoy the sun and, you know, sit in the light of God's glory. Fine, but that's not the way revival works.
Hey, and let's clarify too, you mentioned that he literally was working himself to death. So one of the very cool things about George Whitfield is the accounts where he would preach to more than 30,000 people in an open air area, right? So you're out in a field, 30,000 people without a microphone, without a megaphone, no sound system. Benjamin Franklin was a guy who became connected with George Whitfield, and some of their relationship, their dynamic is actually really fun to study historically, because Franklin's a guy that we don't argue was a Christian, although Franklin was very pro-Bible. He was very pro-Christian movements in a lot of ways, but Franklin wrote about the impact and the effect of George Whitfield on communities, where Whitfield would go to a town, and Franklin said it was amazing after Whitfield had left because all of a sudden people weren't out on the bars all night, and you could walk through the town and people's houses, they would have windows open, and you would hear families just singing hymns and singing Bible songs, and the whole town had changed because of Whitfield. Well, Franklin was one of the guys who identified that Whitfield would speak to these massive crowds, and Franklin was so impressed with the strength of Whitfield's voice. And he thought that voice can be heard from a long way away. So Franklin, kind of the scientific guy, decides, I want to see how far away I can hear his voice. So presumably he starts at the front of the crowd and begins stepping away, pacing away from Whitfield as he's teaching, as he's preaching. And Franklin goes roughly a mile and says you could hear his voice a mile away. Now, the reason this matters, when you are projecting that strongly toward the end of Whitfield's ministry, one of the things that was noted is at times he would have very strong coughing spells. He would cough up blood. At times at the end of him preaching, he would go off on the side and just cough so much and cough up so much blood and hacking up so much that he literally was destroying his throat, his lungs. And I guess doctors can actually speculate part of maybe what was going on with him, and I know doctors have, but the point was, part of what he was doing in his own lifestyle was causing him to get very sick. That actually led to him dying. So when we say he worked himself to death, literally because he was speaking so much and projecting so hard, it was destroying his throat, his lungs, and he ends up dying after getting very sick from all the preaching he did. So that's part of what we're referencing. He literally preached himself to death because he believed what was happening in America, that the messages he were preaching were so important that it was more important for Americans and Christians to hear and be challenged by the Word of God than it was for him to live a healthy life. That's an interesting thought.
So if you really want a revival, maybe a question to ask is, how hard are you willing to work? Are you willing to do the Whitfield kind of things? Not everybody's going to do that, but there's no question that a revival is a lot of hard work. The other thing you mentioned was opposition. If you look at Whitfield, you think, man, here's a guy who's bringing so many people to Christ. I mean, he's turning the nation in the right direction. You got to think religious people are going to like this, and they didn't. His greatest opponents were religious leaders. It's interesting, as you look at Whitfield, there's a lot of publications written against him, a lot of things attacking him, and they're written by religious leaders, not by secular ones. It wasn't the secular crowd who was going after him. It was the religious crowd. And as he starts this thing, he's preaching outside. Well, he's preaching outside because he's got some big crowds, but he also has some small crowds too. He's preaching outside because preachers won't let him come in their buildings. This is my place. You can't come in here. And so he's having to work on the outside, and we actually have records where preachers would tell their congregations, Whitfield's in town. I want you to go to the meeting. I want you to pelt him with tomatoes or cabbages or rocks. I want you to get up in the trees over him where he's in the shaded wood area. I want you to get over him in trees. I want you to pee on him. I want you to defecate on him. This is what pastors are saying. You would think, no, wait a minute, he's doing something good for God. Don't we all agree with that? Absolutely not. And so much of what Whitfield did, especially in those early decades, lots and lots and lots of opposition. And you know, we have a very good friend in Arkansas who has a colloquial kind of phrase. He said, you know, revivals, it's kind of like with Noah on the ark. Noah, with all that flood and all the waters around him, he wasn't nearly as concerned with what was around him on the outside as with all the woodpeckers that were on the inside trying to destroy stuff. And it really kind of goes that way, that so often in a revival, it's those who should be supporting you turn on you, and you're going, wait a minute, don't we all agree on this? And this is where ministers are today. I would say the greatest attacks we receive are from religious folks, not from secular folks. Sure. And so there's so many that turn against, oh, you can't say that, and you don't have the evidence. Yes, we do. We have the evidence right here. But nonetheless, they don't like what we're saying. And so that's what you also find in the Great Awakening. So again, the perception is often wrong that we have on this is going to be a great peaceful time when we all join hands and sing Kumbaya, and that's just not what happens. Yeah,
and this is where we point out that some of the greatest oppositions in American history were at times of national revivals. And this is something that as we're looking right now, and for many of us, we're praying, God, help us, help this nation. We're looking, what can we do? And we're going to get involved locally, and we're going to vote, and we're going to do all these things. That's great. The reality is, just because we're facing opposition doesn't mean that this is maybe a time that no, we can't be in an awakening. Look at the opposition. No, that actually might be one of the good indicators of why we are in the middle of an awakening, because this is historically what we see, this opposition. And so examples from Whitfield that certainly lessons we should learn along the way are that a revival takes a lot of hard work. And Whitfield was not doing this thinking that I'm saving America. He was doing it thinking this is the right thing to do. That he was challenging some of the existing religious status quo, because he said, guys, here's what the Bible says. In fact, if we think of the First Great Awakening and you look at maybe the sermons that are the most recognized, probably the most famous sermon from the First Great Awakening was from Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And it really is worth reading. You can find it online. And studying something about Jonathan Edwards, really remarkable. And there's a lot of fun story associated with that he was nearsighted, that back then people didn't talk from a pulpit like we're talking now. They were not looking out at the audience and congregation. They actually generally were reading their sermon, and they were just turning the page and reading and reading and reading. So Jonathan Edwards was considered nearsighted, and so he actually would have to hold the sermon up in front of him. And back then, they didn't do like we see a lot of pastors do today, where they address the audience. They're looking right at them. Back then, pretty much everybody wrote their sermon down, so it wasn't extemporaneous preaching or speaking. It literally was reading the sermon, and so Jonathan Edwards would turn the page, and he was reading his sermon. Well, in the midst of his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, there's a lot of really fun reports and stories that as he was preaching this sermon, that people saw the floor opened up and they saw hell and fire below them, and they were so scared they were going to fall into hell. They began grabbing onto the pews and trying not to fall in. And Jonathan Edwards arguably didn't know any of this was happening, because it's reported that as he was reading, he actually said, "Guys, be quiet. I'm trying to read my sermon." He had no idea what was happening. He just continued to read the sermon. Well, this is where back the First Great Awakening, probably the most famous sermon was Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God.
And it's interesting, we have some of the sermons from back in that era, and these are handwritten sermons. And the preacher would work all week long in writing out the sermon. And these, I mean, like this little delicate sermon here, it is, oh my, I mean, reading that, you would go nearsighted just reading that, and it's, you know, several pages, it's all written out here. And so he would be reading this to the congregation, and that's what they'd do. They'd work all week long to get some written sermon, and they'd read it on Sunday. And so that is the most famous sermon. You can imagine the drama we would see of watching people clinging on to stuff, and he'd say, "Hey, cool it back there. I'm trying to read my sermon." And he's just looking at it, not seeing what's going on.
So that's probably the most famous sermon from the First Great Awakening. But the most influential sermon, we would probably argue, was from George Whitfield. And he had a sermon that was called Father Abraham. And in this sermon, he says that he had this vision, this dream, that he goes to heaven, and there in heaven, Father Abraham meets him. And so he says to Father Abraham, where are my Methodist brethren, that I can see and be reunited with my Methodist brethren? And Abraham says, there's no Methodists in heaven. And he says, oh, well, where's the Wesleyans? There's no Wesleyans here. Well, where are the Baptists? And he just goes through all these different denominations from back in their era. And Father Abraham says, there are none of those people here. And he says, well, then, Father Abraham, if none of those people made it, who made it? And Abraham replies with a verse from the book of Acts. And it says, well, the people that make it to heaven are those who fear God and do righteousness. Those will be accepted by him. And Whitfield has this revelation that he then shares with the crowd. He said, God help us forget titles and names, that we get caught up in denominations, and God help us realize that we are all one. This was arguably the most significant sermon. In fact, many founding fathers talked about hearing this sermon is what allowed them to be united with other people from different denominations. And that level of unity is what helped them be united enough to fight the British in the American Revolution.
If you look at the American Revolution time frame, the 13 colonies, 9 of them had state-established denominations. They're saying, this is our religion in this state or our denomination, and you're not welcome here. And so it's interesting that the first time the Founding Fathers got together since September 1774, the 13 colonies all sent representatives, and they hadn't met each other. The guys from Massachusetts didn't know the guys in Virginia, and the guys from Virginia didn't know the guys in Georgia. They're all together, and they come up with this idea, let's open with prayer. And when they do, some of the leading religious figures in America, for example, John Jay of New York. John Jay is the founder and a president of the American Bible Society. What a great group that is. John Jay said, whoa, we can't have prayer here. We have Episcopalians and we have Presbyterians and we have all these, and we can't all pray together on the same thing. And that's where Sam Adams has this flashback to Father Abraham. He says, yeah, we can. He says, any man that fears God and is a patriot, I think we can all pray together. And after that little kind of flashback to all those years that Whitfield had been preaching the sermon, they finally got to put it into effect. And literally, what happened that morning after having opposition, they end up with about a 2-hour prayer and Bible service together. John Adams talks about several chapters they studied of the Bible that morning in that service. And so it's a real turnaround time, but it goes back to that Father Abraham sermon. And this is the first time they came together. And folks like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and Franklin, others talk about how impactful that sermon was. And so that's another indication of a great awakening, is it eventually works its way into some policy areas, but that doesn't mean everybody's going to agree with it. I mean, you may get a lot of opposition as Whitfield got along the way and as they even had that morning when they opened prayer, but you finally see some changes in the culture as a result of what's been going on for decades.
So one of the things, again, from Whitfield, the first thing we talked about, one of the lessons learned from Whitfield is that a revival takes a lot of hard work. Whitfield literally works himself to death, but also in the midst of revival, there can be a lot of religious and political opposition, which Whitfield, of course, encountered. Anytime you challenge the existing status quo of religious faith, there's going to be pushback, there's going to be opposition, that's going to happen. That's what happened with Whitfield. But one of the things that happens in a revival is God stirs up a hunger for biblical truth and righteousness. And not everybody latches onto this. Not everybody's going the same direction. America's a really great example. Looking at the First and Second Great Awakening, not everybody was unified in the American Revolution. Not everybody was unified during the Civil War period. There was a great division, but there was a hunger for people to get back to biblical truth, and there was a restoration of righteousness, of a push for biblical justice. And these are things that we can identify happening from the First and Second Great Awakening. Again, there's a lot of lessons to learn. We're really only through the First Great Awakening right now. There's a lot we can talk about with the Second Great Awakening. So we're going to spend a little more time getting into the Second Great Awakening, talking about what revivals actually look like historically in America, what lessons we can learn from it. And if you want to know more about this along the way, you can go to the WallBuilders website, wallbuilders.com. Check out our book, The American Story, where we highlight many things from the First Great Awakening. Many of these people, we've talked about some of the lessons from Whitfield. It's documented, it's there. You can go back and see it. Even the first prayer in Congress. We get into that and talk about the motion from Sam Adams, and we're going to pray together and what's going to happen. There's a lot of fun history. You can learn the WallBuilders website or our new book, The American Story, or just tune in next time for another episode of One Room Schoolhouse.